Hello, War Factor. This is Alex Wallace here with another episode of Author Talk, a particularly navel-gazing episode of Author Talk because I have here today Warp Factor's very own Matthew Kresal, author of Our Man on the Hill, published through Sea Lion Press. Matthew, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, for those at Warp Factor who don't already know who I am, I'm Matthew Kresal. I am a nerd, writer, podcaster, and critic with many and varying interests. I've written about Doctor Who and Star Trek and alternate history and anything and everything in between James Bond over on Warp Factor. And I also write short fiction and, of course, my novel, Our Man on the Hill, which came out from Sea Lion Press last year.
Also, I will note, and has been noted on War Factor, his short story Moonshot, published in 2020's Alternate Australia, won the Sidewise Award for alternate history short form of that year. So we have quite the distinguished alumni here.
Yeah, that's still slightly surreal to me that I've got it. I don't know if anybody can notice, but if you look about right here, it's actually sitting on top of a bookcase at the moment.
Yeah, I can see it in front of the Titanic poster.
Yes.
Okay, so to Our Man on the Hill, what made you want to write this particular book? Like this? Why this?
I guess the genesis of it in a strange way is owed to a podcast and now a pal of mine named Shane Whaley called Spybery. Because I just realized you can't see the shirt I'm wearing. But Shane started Spybery back in 2017, and I've had an interest in spy fiction dating back, I don't know, my early teens, maybe even before that, because I've been a history nerd and a space nerd practically from the womb. And being interested in space history led me to the Cold Wars, which I guess inevitably led me to spy stuff, because espionage really is the front line of the Cold War. And I'd been a big James Bond fan since I was 13. John le Carré followed, etc., etc. But it was kind of one of those interests that I've kind of wandered in and out of. And then Shane started Spybery in 2017, and I was lucky enough to kind of be involved with it sort of on and off, and especially with the Facebook group that goes for it. And I kind of was in the point where I'd been doing NaNoWriMo. That's, for those who don't know, National Novel Writing Month, where every November a bunch of crazy people get together and try to write a first draft of a novel in a month. And so I'd been very much thinking I wanted to write a novel. And I guess I wanted to do a spy book, but I knew I didn't want to write I guess what you might call a kiss kiss bang bang book. I didn't want to do like a James Bond or a Jason Bourne. Not that I don't love that stuff, and not that I wouldn't be interested in writing that in future, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do at the time. And one day in my local public library, I picked up a book called The Haunted Wood. It's a nonfiction book published in the late 90s by Alan Weinstein and Alexander Veselev, where for a brief point in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, they got access to the Soviet archives and were able to kind of discover this incredible trove of stuff that had happened in the 30s and 40s with Americans spying for the Russians. And I think it was reading that, and particularly the story of a New York congressman named Samuel Dickstein, who in the late 30s, early 40s, actually became a paid agent for the Soviet Union. And interestingly enough, was also a member, one of the founding members, in fact, of something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which became notorious in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, basically leading the way to Joe McCarthy. And I think that got kind of the wheels turning. And eventually, I don't remember if it was in Haunted Wood or it may have been somewhere else, I came across this wonderful Harry Truman quote along the lines of, the Kremlin has no greater asset in this country at the moment than Senator Joe McCarthy. And I know what President Truman meant when he said that, but for those who know espionage, fact and fiction, asset has a whole nother meaning to it. And the light bulb went off. And at first I said, I'm not going to write this thing because this is just absurd. And somebody else has got to have done it anyways. And I credit my best friend, Emily, for convincing me it was worth writing. And I thought it was going to be a short story. And I sat down in guess it would have been August of 2017 to start writing it, right around 4.5, 5 years ago now. And very quickly realized I didn't have a short story, I had a novel. And it kind of grew from there, really. So that's a long-winded kind of answer to say it was a bunch of things that kind of all came together at once.
I mean, isn't that just the origin of all great fiction? A bunch of things just falling into place at one particular point in time, and
Yeah.
that's just human culture.
Yeah, I mean, there's in my experience, because I've been lucky enough, I've interviewed writers myself over the years. There's two different kinds of writers when you go to them and ask, where do you get your ideas from? There's the ones who don't want to admit they know where because they're afraid of being, of looking like they're suddenly not very smart or they've accidentally plagiarized somebody, or people who don't honestly know. And unfortunately, I am somebody who usually knows precisely where my ideas come from, for better or worse.
I mean, I understand that. I've written my own fiction, and I mean, I'm reminded of that Mark Twain quote about how writers just have. He calls it a kaleidoscope, where you take all the old stuff and you just swirl it around,
Yeah.
and you have a whole new pattern, and that's what originality is. I Mark Twain put it better than I did. So yeah, it's just one of those weird contingent aspects of history, which in a way your book's about.
Yeah.
Of Joe McCarthy literally being a communist spy. So how did you go about figuring how that would work? Because it feels so utterly counterintuitive, and as you said, kind of absurd. But you barreled on with it, and you wrote a very good novel. So how did you make that work?
Well, thank you very much for saying that. And for those who don't know, Alex very kindly reviewed the book last year at one point and was far too kind about it, as far as I'm concerned. I suppose that I did what anybody who's going to write any historical fiction, or I think anybody who wants to try and cloak the thing and cloak a story in as much factual stuff as they can might do, which is I went and started doing research. I'd had an interest in the Cold War, and I'd had an interest in Cold War espionage for a while. So I knew the basics, and I knew who Joe McCarthy was, and I had a good idea of the McCarthy period. What was fun for me was I kind of got to pull a couple of books off the shelf. One called Shooting Star, and the other one, The Life and Times of Joe McCarthy, the authors of which escape me at the moment. Tom Wick, I think, did Shooting Star, which is a very brief, it's less than 200 pages. It's very concise, and he actually was a reporter in the 1950s on Capitol Hill and actually met McCarthy on a number of occasions. But the two of them kind of gave me the outline of what I needed to know, and particularly the later book, because it is a massive several hundred page book. Gave me a lot of the minutiae. And it was going in there and finding all the odd little details that one could kind of pull with. Like when McCarthy was running in 46 for the Senate for the first time, he came out with this wonderful piece of damaging information about his opponent, and nobody to this day really seems to know where he got it from. Or the fact that the radio workers union in Wisconsin, which was very much left-leaning, if not outright communist, suddenly decided to swap their endorsement from McCarthy's opponent to McCarthy himself, which seems very counterintuitive. And there was just a lot of those little details. And in fact, McCarthy's big famous speech that he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950 was what seems to have been a last minute decision. He literally got in the car on the way to the airport to get on a plane to go fly to give this speech, going on a speaking tour across the Lincoln's birthday weekend. And he literally pulls out two speeches and asks the guy, which one do you think I ought to give? And it made me wonder, well, why did he have two speeches prepared? So a lot of it was sort of finding those kind of little incidents in McCarthy's life and career where I could kind of go in and do it. And also because I had read Haunted Wood, I had an idea of how, admittedly pre-war, when we weren't necessarily looking for Soviet spies, they had managed to handle people like Samuel Dickstein, for example. So I was able to kind of cloak my fiction in a lot of factual stuff. And my rule for myself doing it is I didn't want to go overboard with it. I suppose if I have a slight regret about the book, and it is a slight regret, it's that I probably could have leaned into going much further with my alternate history idea than I actually did. But I felt at the time, back in 2017, 2018, when I was writing it, I felt like I was off on enough of a limb at the time that I didn't want to do anything too crazy.
And of course, this is what you do with the sequels.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Dobbs, when he wrote House of Cards, wrote it with one ending. And then when it got adapted for the BBC so wonderfully with Ian Richardson playing Francis Urquhart, Andrew Davies, who adapted it for the BBC, completely changed the ending. So Michael Dobbs went and wrote 2 sequels based on the ending to that. So I suppose I could go off one day and do that if I really wanted to.
I mean, it's whatever inspiration strikes you in that moment. Because as a writer, I know how fickle that is.
Yeah.
So what else? And I'm trying to phrase this question correctly. Is there any particular difference when you're writing fictional characters versus when you're writing the historical character, in this case McCarthy? Because I mean, admittedly, Joe McCarthy can be pretty cartoonish to begin with. So is there anything that was different about the process between the two, would you say?
In terms of writing historical figures, the big thing is that particularly with McCarthy, because I was working in, thank God for the congressional record in public domain, because anything in the book where McCarthy is on the floor of the Senate or he's in a committee room is actually what he said, or it's a paraphrasing, a close paraphrasing to what he said, because sometimes you have to condense things down or else you're going to run the length of a novel doing a committee hearing.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to interest anybody, myself included. So because I was doing that, I felt a need to try and match his voice and to try and figure out what, I knew what Joe McCarthy was saying in public. What could Joe McCarthy say in private? And that was something where the 2 books I sort of read and kept going back to were really helpful, because you would find where he was very open in talking with reporters and whatnot. So there was a lot of off the record stuff that got written down that sat in people's archives until people started writing biographies after he died, which made it a bit easier to find his voice. But I think that, and also the fact that I had fictional characters interacting with him, people like Ralph Walker, who was his handler for the Russians. Because I had that, I knew I had to make McCarthy sound right, which meant I had to make everybody else kind of sound right. So it's about the kind of the mosaic, if you know what I mean, and sort of, or putting a tapestry together that all the threads have got to go together correctly. It was a challenge. And I think one of the challenges, especially when I did the editing, was going back and going, okay, is this something that somebody in the late 40s, early 50s would have said? And weirdly, actually, one of the things that was a big help in actually trying to get the dialogue right and trying to get the ear for things right was actually going back and reading and looking at stuff from the period, particularly movies and radio drama, and where you could kind of get an ear for how people spoke. It's the same challenge as writing a Sherlock Holmes pastiche or something, which I've done as well. That a lot of it's just trying to get the rhythms right. But certainly the challenge with writing real people and putting them into fictional context is they still have to sound like themselves. And it is, as we're both readers of alternate history, it's a fine tightrope that you often have to walk, and it's very easy to fall off of it. So whether I did or not is, up entirely to the reader, but I certainly gave it my best shot.
I mean, I'd say it worked for me, and I think you have a very salient point about this whole verisimilitude of the dialogue, because I mean, if you watch the movies from the period, it is a different dialect almost. I mean, there is the effect of the transatlantic dialect. They also wanted to sell movies in Britain, because, but yeah, the slang was different. One author on Facebook I follow keeps harping on how people moved different.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lot of that, and also it's the way people also move differently because they're also wearing, typically wearing a lot more clothing. It was funny. I had to think a lot about hats and overcoats because we don't typically wear either one anymore. So you suddenly have to think a lot about that as well. Something else that may have helped me is I was at the same time I was writing the book, I was also in the middle of research on a nonfiction book I was writing for Obverse on the Dark Skies TV series from the 90s, which itself is an alternate history conspiracy theory driven piece of work. So that sort of helped because I was in the middle of research in that, so I was kind of in sort of the 50s 60s period anyways, which is maybe a little later than when the book was at, but it sort of put me in the right mindset, I think, too. And certainly, Dark Skies' approach to history, that everything as we know it is a lie, and all these real life events have actually been driven by some secret conflict in hidden hands, I think probably was at least a subconscious influence on the book too.
Yeah, absolutely. The spy genre is one that I think tends towards that sort of thinking, just by virtue that there's stuff that's going on that the public doesn't know about, and there is always a temptation to like throw in a bit of that, and it can work well, and sometimes, and you have its cousin, when you throw in the paranormal stuff, like if you've read any of Tim Powers stuff, I think Declare in particular, you see those two working together like hand in glove.
Yeah.
And so it's fiction making strange bedfellows again. So
I mean, the thing about spy fiction is I think Jason King, I think it is, on the Facebook group, or the Spyberry Facebook group, likes to say it's a very broad church. It covers everything from, on one end of the spectrum, people like Graham Greene and John le Carre, to people like Len Dayton, and on the far end of it, you have people you have James Bond and as I like to call it, the Kalashnikov kids, of people like Brad Thor, and the kind of the more action adventure side of it. So it's something you can do a lot with, depending on what you're precisely aiming to do as well. But I was in the mood. I don't want to say I wanted to write something super serious. I love John le Carre as much as the next person, but I wouldn't claim that John le Carre would have ever written something like Our Man on the Hill. But it was certainly, I wanted to kind of evoke that side of the genre. There's a very particularly British sensibility to spy fiction.
Yes.
That takes it a bit more seriously. And I suppose I wanted, I guess, in sort of my underlying statement, I guess what I really wanted to do was to kind of bring that kind of more serious, I want to say cerebral, but that's putting too fine a point on it, approach to things, rather than, car chases and bombs and explosions and that kind of thing. I think there's a couple of minor bits of action in the book, but it wasn't what I was interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that influence from like the old British writers, and because really the British invented the genre. You had Le Carre is British, Fleming's British, Erskine Childers British.
Yeah. I mean, the Brits really dominated the genre. There's a wonderful book by Mike Ripley called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which I realized I quoted the title of earlier. But he did a whole study of it, as he put it, from Casino Royale, which is 1953, to The Eagle Has Landed, which is in 1976, Jack Higgins. And sort of this sort of 30-odd year, this sort of 20, 30-year period where the British sort of dominated and laid the groundwork for a lot of the genre stuff that came later. So, but that was, I suppose I tried to bring a British sensibility to a very American topic.
Which is a very interesting way of putting it, because when I'm looking back at Our Man on the Hill, which I read last year, I can see the resemblance in tone to a lot of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, in the sense that, I mean, Fleming's novels are much headier than the films.
Yeah.
Much headier, much more. I mean, it makes James Bond come off as very neurotic and very insecure in a way that I don't see in any of the Bond films.
Yeah.
Maybe Craig, maybe Dalton, none
Yeah.
of the others. And so there's this sense of unease under the whole thing that I think you did very well in your novel. This was politics making very strange bedfellows,
Yeah.
and so there was that inherent tension between literal Marxist Leninist revolutionary communism on the one hand, and literally Joe McCarthy on the other hand.
Yeah. I think a lot of it was driven by, at least in writing the book, was kind of my, if in inverted commas, understanding of McCarthy and sort of the way he comes across in a lot of the biographies of him. And certainly, to be fair, I think the Life and Times in particular, I think, was a very critical one of him. I think he came across very much as an opportunist. That he was somebody who kind of saw in this kind of unique historical confluence of Alger sort of the Alger his trials, the unease, the Rosenbergs are going on trial in this period. There's enough stuff kind of all happening at once in Joe McCarthy, who's been an up and comer. And in some ways, I think that was one of the things that made McCarthy so fascinating to write about, is in some ways, he is very much one of those grand American rags to riches stories. This is a guy who comes from a poor farm in Wisconsin to becoming one of the most powerful people in the entire country. The guy who basically came from nowhere in many respects. I mean, he drops out of school, he goes and runs this very successful farming business for a while. When the farming business goes bust, he goes and puts himself through 4 years of high school in a year, puts himself through law school and everything else. In some ways, he's almost in a different context. He would be admirable. It's what he did once he got to power that really, I think, defined him, for better or worse. And I do think, on the basis of some of the more recent stuff about him, that he may have sensed, in fact, too late, that he probably screwed up. And go ahead.
And so you have the traditional, does power corrupt or does power reveal? And
Yeah.
so you have, and so it then leaves a question: who was Joe McCarthy? Was he an opportunist who just wanted power, or did he believe what he says? And I would say your novel really relies on the opportunist stance on that question, because he gets bought out by the Soviets.
Yeah. I mean, there's a paradox in the whole McCarthy period, which is that, and I think it's John Earl Haynes, as a historian of the period, pointed out that McCarthy named something close to, I think it was somewhere between 150 and 200 people, of which you can count on one hand the number of people who were actual security risks, and none of whom you could actually prove, even with the stuff that came out in the 90s through Venona and through the Haunted Wood, that you could actually prove that any of them actually were Soviet spies. On the other hand, we have sufficient evidence that there was, throughout the 30s and 40s, lesser extent after 1945, because of the events I dramatized in I think it's now chapter 2 of the novel. It was chapter 1 for the longest time. That there was a lot of people spying within the US government, within military agencies, within indeed the OSS, the precursors of the CIA, a lot of people who were passing on information to the Russians. A lot of whom did it for ideological, idealistic reasons. Again, context is everything in this case. And I saw an interview here again recently with Alexander Veselev, where he commented that the people were judged in the 1950s for things that they did in the 30s and 40s, without anybody remembering what the context of that was. And I suppose that there's an argument to be made, as has indeed been made by people including Glenn Beck and Ann Coulter, that Joe McCarthy was right in his overall thesis. The question is, the fact is, McCarthy arrived too late, too loud, and with too little factual information to actually make any kind of difference, and destroyed the lives and careers of a lot of very innocent people in the process, something I hope the novel demonstrates, particularly a guy named Owen Latimer. So I suppose that's one of the kind of legacies of McCarthy is, did the ends justify the means? And also, going back to McCarthy the Opportunist, there was a wonderful anecdote, which I don't think I worked into the book. This is the problem with writing things and being asked about it years later,
Yeah.
was that after he got done grilling Owen Latimer in front of the newsreel cameras and the reporters and whatnot, walked up to him and shook his hand and put his arm around him and went, we put on a good show, didn't we? And it was just kind of like, I think McCarthy was somebody who couldn't afford in his own mind to be a has-been or a could have been. He had to be somebody, and this was how he did it. Was he latched on to the great anti-communist crusade of the early 50s, and took it as far as he could, and arguably, as the Army McCarthy hearings and Roy Cohen proved, took it too far. But that was, McCarthy was a fascinating figure to write. But he wasn't somebody who actually, for that reason, I felt I could make a protagonist out of. He was somebody, it was a lot easier to look at from a distance than it was to try and get in his head. I think I did a couple of times in the book. I know there's a chapter when I first introduce him, and there's one when he's kind of realizing that he's on his way. But for the most part, I used the other characters, particularly Ralph Walker, who was his handler, and also later on in the book, James Angleton, who was very much a real person, the longtime head of CIA counterintelligence, to kind of look at McCarthy rather than trying to get in Joe McCarthy's head, because that's not a pleasant place to be, I don't think.
Yeah, he's not your typical hero. Indeed, he has sort of elements of like a Greek tragic hero, but I feel like there isn't quite the admirability that a Greek tragic hero has in Joe McCarthy. He's just, I mean, from what you say and from what I remember reading, from what I've read of him, there are parts he almost comes off as kind of pathetic, and so there's this fascination that's brought on by almost bile, like gut revulsion, that makes him interesting in spite of being, Joe McCarthy.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain, as you say, there's a certain fascination with trying to understand why people are the way they are. And, that was certainly part of, it was the thing that kind of came secondary in writing the book, because what I really wanted to do was to write a spy story. And I think I did. But in the process of writing it, Joe McCarthy was revealed to be a far more interesting and dare I say three-dimensional figure than I had previously thought him. I think it's very easy to caricature him and sort of, as you said, I think said earlier, make a cartoon outline of him, rather than try and deal with the flesh and blood human being that was kind of underneath. He's, as I said, he's in some ways he's almost admirable. This guy who came from nothing to that, but it was not always a pleasant place to be, sort of trying to get into Joe McCarthy's head.
I mean, alternate history, especially as traditionally written, you have to get into the heads of a lot of unsavory characters, just because it's dealing with historical figures, and a lot of the people who derive that sort of genre, who drive history, are often unpleasant people. And I think that you could argue the spy genre has a history of this too. Just, I mean, even in the books, James Bond is deeply troubled and not exactly pleasant. And I think that this is an aspect that has been brought over to the films pretty much, is that he sees people as tools.
Yeah.
And it's very utilitarian and very dehumanizing, and I think there's something fascinating in that to a lot of people. And I've only read 2 John Le Carre's, but from the 2 I did read, I saw a lot of that too in those. So yeah, I think that's another thing that drives both the genres, and it makes sense that they would intersect there.
Yeah. And I think there's an argument to be made, that politicians, and certainly the way I wrote McCarthy in the book, kind of viewed people the same way. that it was kind of, ends justify means, I think, for lack of a better way of putting it. And if you want to evoke that cliche, um, it certainly seems to drive a lot of espionage fiction. It drives a lot of politics. If you think about the Stalinist period for that matter, it was constantly, the 5-year plan, great utopian visions of what's going to come, and it doesn't matter how many people have to die, et cetera, et cetera. So that was certainly in the back of my mind as I was writing it as well. And I think it's Graham Greene who once said that, life is not black and white, it's shades of gray. And I think that that's something that's easy to forget writing fiction, and it's something that's also easy to forget looking at history as well. I think that's one of the things. Alternate history, I think, sometimes falls into this trap, and I think historical writing in general, sort of doing nonfiction, we're talking about, falls into that trap sometimes. You can't see the wood for the trees.
Yes.
And sort of one of the things I think that alternate history can do, and also that spy fiction does, particularly if you're writing spy fiction in period, and there's something to be said about writing stuff in the Cold War period. I think somebody once observed that one of the problems with writing modern spy fiction is that, at least, is that we don't know where the front lines are, and we don't know who the enemies are anymore. At least with the Cold War, we kind of knew it was the Russians, it was the communists, etc. And those, it's a lot harder to know who they are. Of course, we say that too, and the whole premise of Our Man on the Hill is that the greatest apparent anti-communist crusader of them all might have actually been working for them as well. So it's that's events make strange bedfellows, history makes strange bedfellows.
Yes.
I mean, World War II, you had Winston Churchill, the most ardent, member of the right and, British Conservative Party, who absolutely loathed communists and had done his best to take them on during his time in cabinet in the early part of the century, cuddling up to Uncle Joe, as it were. And certainly it's been observed before, sort of the way the British, sort of the British press and government and community all kind of felt the need to make sort of very sharp handbrake turns to deal with Stalin influenced a lot of George Orwell in 1984.
Yes. I mean, I'm reminded of the CIA guy who was up testifying in Congress in the 90s to encourage them to keep funding the CIA, is that the enemy used to be a big dragon, but now the enemy is a bunch of snakes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of.
Yeah, it was certainly the case. I mean, you look at the events of the last 20 years, indeed our respective lifetimes. It's whether it's the war on terror or events more recently with the resurgent Russia, for that matter.
Yeah.
So, we could sit here and debate whether we're in Cold War 2.0, as I think somebody's called it, but it's the same blurred lines are there once again. And there's a great quote from Ian Fleming's first Bond novel, Casino Royale. I think that Bond observes to Mathis at one point that history is changing awfully fast these days. With the heroes and the villains are changing sides, and I can't keep track of who they are anymore.
I mean, I'm reminded of Judi Dench's M in one of the Craig Bond movies. I forget which one. Christ, I missed the Cold War.
Casino Royale, funnily enough. Yeah.
It was one of those. And also Lenin, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen.
Yeah.
And also, as the internet cliche is, that we are currently living in the Cold War, but everyone is stupider this time.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that Lenin quote. That was one of the challenges of actually writing the book, is McCarthy got into the Senate in 1946, and basically nothing happens for the first 3 years after he gets there. And I cannot tell you the amount of time I spent in my own head trying to figure out how to make that time jump.
Yeah.
And it actually makes sense. And also, for that matter, going through the minutiae, as it were, of McCarthy's career, all the stuff that happens between 1950 and 53, and trying to figure out what stuff I could draw, what stuff would be good to dramatize in the book or to have sort of an alternate history play on, and explain it in kind of this sort of conspiratorial context. And also deciding that you don't have to go into every little nitty gritty bit of detail, and just kind of going, okay, I'm gonna pick the highlights and kind of run with it. And that's also one of the benefits of writing fiction over nonfiction. I did have a writing buddy of mine, funnily enough, who tried to convince me at one point to rewrite the whole thing as a nonfiction book. If only for the purely cynical reason that it would sell a lot more copies.
So, are you talking like as an actual nonfiction book, or as like
Yeah.
the? Oh,
Yeah, I don't know to this day how serious he was, but he certainly made the pitch to me at one point. I would probably sell a lot more copies if I rewrote the thing as a nonfiction book. But I told him I had to remind him that would require a lot more footnoting than I was willing to go back and do.
I mean, there is a long tradition within the alternate history genre of writing fake textbooks, so
Yeah,
that it could have worked. It
Yeah.
worked for Robert Sobel, and he's a classic. It worked for John Kessler. Worked for like maybe a third of the Sea Lion Press stall, so it would have been doable. I think. I'm not sure I could have done. I think you could have.
yeah, well, it's kind of you to say, but again, it wasn't the story. It wasn't the story I wanted to tell.
Yeah.
It wasn't the story I was interested in telling, and it definitely wasn't the way I wanted to tell it. But also, for I guess slightly cynical reasons of my own as an author starting out, I had no wish to destroy my reputation by putting out a potentially sensationalist nonfiction title that would eventually be discredited. Though there's certainly people who it's not hurt their careers to do, but I did not want to be one of those people, I guess.
I mean, writing a book that would be discredited about a guy who made allegations who were later discredited. There's a certain poetry to that, I think.
That's fair. I mean, I did have somebody else ask me at the time I was writing the book. He said, "What are you going to do if it turns out that some documents get declassified or something, and it turns out that your premise is 100% on the money?" And all I could say is, "Hope to God people buy the book."
If anything, that would help you.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there's a book in the Sea Lion Press catalog that was about Boris Johnson becoming British Prime Minister before Boris Johnson became the actual British Prime Minister, which is a very, very odd prescience there, and I believe that weirdly predictive stories do get sold, get talked about after big events. Like I do remember pandemic films being big on Netflix.
Yeah.
When COVID was a relatively new thing for at least the West in those first few months after March 2020 when.
Oh yeah.
And so I do remember that. I don't think I watched them. I read some pandemic books which were terrifying in other ways, but that's a digression.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting when real life sort of intersects with fiction, and you kind of go back, because I did that too, because Bryce Abel, who co-created Dark Skies, him and his wife Jackie did in 2007 actually wrote, and eventually it was produced for the Hallmark Channel, a miniseries called Pandemic, with a pretty good cast. I actually did review it for Warp Factor for anybody who wants to go out to the site and dig through. And one of the things that was really interesting was how much of what was kind of happening those early weeks and months that they managed to kind of predict in there. And following Bryce on social media as well, him and Jackie both would get on there and go like, "Dear God, we didn't want to be on this ride, this bit on the money about it." Because there was one scene from that in particular where because it's set in LA, that they had a ice rink in LA that was turned into a temporary morgue because they had run out of places to keep bodies. And it turned out that actually was happening in places in Europe, particularly in Spain, where there were so many people dying from it that they could not they couldn't arrange enough funerals, they couldn't bury people fast enough, that they were literally requisitioning, ice rinks and everything else to kind of keep people. And it was like, you want to be, as again, you want to cloak your fiction in as much reality as you can, but it gets a little unsettling when reality catches up with you.
Yeah, I can think of at least one story I wrote where that happened, and
Yeah.
and I felt awful afterwards, even though it made no sense for me to be. Uh,
Yeah, it's a bit like somebody asked, I think when Tom Clancy went on CNN during 9/11, and somebody brought up Dead of Honor, which is his book from massive doorstop of a novel from the mid 90s. It's one of those weird books that could only come out of, mid 90s techno thrillers where the US and Japan go to war. But at the end of the book, a Japanese airline pilot flies a 747 into the Capitol building and basically takes out takes out most of the US government in one go, which as we now know was what part of the aims of one of the planes on 9/11 was aiming for. And somebody asked Clancy on air that day, do you take any kind of responsibility for it? He's like, no, they probably would have figured this out without me. But yeah, it does get unnerving sometimes when reality catches up with you.
yeah, I mean, there's a whole debate about author responsibility here. And I do know that Tom Clancy deliberately gave Ronning the instructions on how to build a nuclear weapon in one of his books,
Some of
specifically.
All fears, I think, and I know Frederick Forsyth as well. And speaking of another British thriller writer, somebody else who, because he came from a journalistic background, would put in a lot of realistic details and whatnot. As he put it, when people asked him about, aren't you afraid of anybody trying to replicate it? He goes, I always put a flaw into the plan where if somebody's going to follow it step by step, they're going to get exposed. He goes, I don't tell, and I'm not going to tell you which one it is from whatever book, because people will know to avoid that step. But sure, but I think that you do kind of have to think things through. I've certainly had a couple of thriller ideas of my own that I've put away in the back of my mind, and I may go to one day or I may not, because I do sometimes worry about, sit there in the middle of the night, as it were, and kind of go, what if somebody decides they're actually going to do this for real?
Yeah, it's thorny. I mean, I've heard similar argued about alternate history and how it may confuse, make the uninitiated confuse alternate history for real history.
Yeah.
Like when they made the film based off of Fatherland in the 90s, the test audiences could not tell the difference between the world where the Nazis won in the movie and the actual, up until recently for them, existing East Germany.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's a genre that requires being a nerd, and for those who aren't, it's going to. I mean, I would understand if they're confused, and
yeah. I mean, I can speak to that from personal experience, because at one point, talking about various issues, I tried to get my mom to watch CSA, the Confederate States of America, the mockumentary film, and my mom messaged me at one point. She watched about 30 minutes or so of it and turned it off because she's like, I don't know what's real and what isn't. And I'm like, it's perfectly obvious. But I also realized that I am a giant history nerd with shelves full of books, and a lot more documentary watching and everything else than probably your average person has. So it is a very narrow line that you walk. And you could argue, people ask Oliver Stone the same thing about films like JFK and Nixon, and certainly those probably are influences on me as well. And his response to those is, I guess, the same response I gave when on the one or two occasions when somebody's asked me, if I'm afraid that people are really going to think that Joe McCarthy was a spy for the Russians. And Oliver Stone's response is, I hope it'll inspire people to go do their own research and not take what I'm saying for granted. And I feel the same way. Though I add the amendum to that, given everything else has been flung at Joe McCarthy over the last 60 years since he passed away, I think being accused of being a Soviet spy is the least of his problems at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think your book benefits in that regard from being sold by an alternate history publisher that you have to go out of your way to find. And so I think that most people who will read it are people who get the basic idea, if nothing else.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why, when I wrote the kind of the afterword, the fact of fiction, as I call it, which was my way of sneaking a Doctor Who reference into the back of the book, because that the fact of fiction was the working title for a 1968 Doctor Who story called The Mind Robber. because I wasn't writing in a Doctor Who period when the show was on the air, so I snuck in a reference another way. But when I wrote that, I explicitly opened it with Our Man on the Hill is most definitely a work of fiction. However, here's all the real bits. And so it is something I definitely kind of thought about. It was also something I thought about because, again, of Dark Skies, because it intermingled so much of real mid-century history and conspiracy theories and whatnot with UFO lore and its own kind of conspiratorial alternate history take on it, including aliens being involved, or Majestic 12, who supposedly are covering up the UFO thing, being responsible for the JFK assassination, which 2 years after the show went off the air, suddenly documents surfaced alleging that was exactly the case. So it is one of those weird things. It's something about this genre that we call home, or in my case, one of the many genres I seem to call home. That for some reason, this one in particular seems to be a place where fact and fiction intertwine, intermingle, and sometimes are really difficult to separate. But then again, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole tenuous relationship to facts that the whole genre has. It's one with trepidation, one that, I mean, again, it's Mark Twain's kaleidoscope. And I think that there's a lot of quote unquote truthiness even in these fictional scenarios. And I mean, look at Turtle Love's Timeline 191 series. He takes the social dynamics of interwar Europe and puts them onto a dynamic America. So there's, you can see the truth from Europe, which isn't the truth from America, but being mishmashed together in a way that gave him 11 books and a good deal of money for his daughter's college funds. So
very true. I mean, there's something to be said. I mean, alternate history revels in parallelism, in sort of taking, sort of drawing sort of between the here and the now, or the then and the now, I should say, or in the case, the thens that might have been in the now, which can be a double-edged sword. And I think, it is entirely possible. We've both read plenty of Turtle Dove to kind of see it, that, that it's a double-edged sword, and you can overplay your hand a bit.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, in fact, is part of why, as I've said earlier, I wrote the book in 2017, 2018 was when I did most of the work. The question that I'm surprised doesn't come up more often than it does is when people say, well, why did you sit on the book for a couple of years? And there's a couple of answers to that. And one of those is, as I was writing the book, particularly during the wonderful month of NaNoWriMo, November 2017, and people, as would happen when you would meet up with your fellow writers and work on things, people would say, what are you working on? And I would tell them, and they go, oh, you're actually writing about this current event that's going on.
Yes.
And that was not what I was doing at all. At least not on a conscious level. And if I wanted to talk about what was going on in the world at that time, I had outlets to do that. And in fact, I have, and I did so at the time in an anthology that was published in there, where I did a UFO story in there because, of course, what else was I going to do? But, it wasn't, I didn't want people seeing more into it than there was. Also, partly because being a writer, I had absolutely no confidence whatsoever in the thing being any good. And, it's one of those, you sit there and you make excuses for not doing things. And one of the big ones I did was, well, I don't have the time to edit it. And I really want to go back to DC and walk around the locations and make sure I get everything down again, because I'd only been to DC the one time as a teenager in 2005. But that informed a lot of the book, and particularly in writing in DC. But I wanted to go back and kind of view it with another eye. And I was starting to get to the point where I thought, okay, I can make a sort of a 2-day trip to DC. And then the pandemic happened. And then I was at home for 4.5 months. And then all of a sudden saying I have no time to edit was no longer an excuse.
Yes.
There's an interesting thing that kind of happens occasionally on Twitter where people talk about whether the pandemic, and particularly those months in 2020 when we all sat at home, was good or bad for creative people and writers, and it seems to be driven into people who suddenly had time to do a whole bunch of things they'd wanted to do but not been able to do, and people who were creatively blocked because they couldn't go out and do things
Yeah.
and go get inspiration and whatnot. Not, I have to say, I was very much in the camp of I suddenly had time to suddenly do things.
Yes.
And, I had time, dedicated that. And I felt, as dumb as it's probably going to sound, I felt guilty as hell about it for the longest time. It was kind of like, all this, all the chaos and death going on. And I'm sitting in here plugging away at my laptop or writing in my notebook every day, like, having a jolly good time. And, it took me a while to get past that point. And I'm kind of glad I did, because, there was 2020 was as horrible of a year as it was for the world at large. As a writer, it was in some ways the odd making of me, I suppose, at least in terms of being published and being something close to professional.
I mean, yeah, it's the same happened with me. That's where the anthology I did that you're in
Yeah.
came from. It's where I wrote my first short story in a couple of years came from, which was in August of 2020, and I entered a vignette competition on Sea Lion Press blog, and that got published. And it was also, I think, was said one of the story I mentioned earlier where I predicted something horrible. I'm like, no, this was not supposed to come true.
Right.
You people, no. And so, I mean, yeah, it was a double-edged sword where I was cut off from a lot, but I had a lot of time to read, and so I just sort of just inhaled a lot, and I exhaled it in a bunch of stories, which were okay, I think.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of articles, and then that brought me to this site
Yeah.
through my guest here, and so here we both are.
Yeah. Talk about the kaleidoscope.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so to discuss your other writing. So
Yep.
again, this is a very navel-gazing question. How did you get on the Warp Factor? How did that happen?
Warp Factor happened. How did it happen? Late 2013, early 2014. I was writing for a site at the time, which is no longer active. And the editor of that site stopped publishing my stuff. And I was looking for another outlet to write. And I can't remember if it popped up as a Facebook ad or if it showed up in one of my Doctor Who groups or something. I'd have to go back and dig around. It had to have been on Facebook because I wasn't on Twitter then. And I answered the call and I said, well, I've been writing stuff for this website, which is, defunct at this point, not active. And I'd be very keen to potentially write for you. And that was kind of where it started. And I think the very first couple of pieces I wrote was one on Third Doctor, because the Big Finish, the company who does the Doctor Who audio dramas, wasn't doing stories with the Third Doctor era very much at the time, for various reasons I won't go into here. So I did a piece kind of talking about what they could do with that, and I ended up being far more on the money about things than I ever imagined I would be. And I also did one on a fairly obscure British TV thing called the Quatermass Experiment, which was originally made in the 50s and didn't get kept in the BBC archives and ended up being remade as a live broadcast in 2005. And that was kind of how I landed there, and those did well. And I've kind of had a running relationship on the site since then. I guess it very much before then, and I still do occasionally do reviews on IMDb and Amazon, and I've been doing those since high school. And sometimes it gets rather cringeworthy when somebody will occasionally message me and kind of go, "Hey, I found your review of this," and I'm like, "Oh God, how old was I when I wrote this?" And that was, I always have looked for outlets to write for things. And that was, Warp Factor was just a good place to go,
Yeah.
and to kind of talk about all things geeky and, again, my many and varying interests. And it was sort of a place where a lot of the Venn diagram that is my life could kind of be put out there. To this day, I'm shocked anybody wants to read what I say nor take it for granted. The really surreal thing of that was having gotten into it in some ways because I wanted to talk about the Big Finish Doctor Who stuff. I'm now quoted on the Big Finish website on a number of releases, and they'll do trailers quoting reviews, and I'll occasionally pop up on there. And I'm like, how did this happen?
Yeah, I understand that very well. Apparently, I mean, I've had that happen with the several indie books I've reviewed, and apparently, my review of Larry Correa and Steve Diamond's most recent novel, Servants of War, quotes my review. I think maybe on the inside.
Yeah,
That's what my my friends at Bain tell me. So yeah, it's just because you feel like there'd be a point where you're just some guy, and then there's another point where you're known reviewer,
yeah,
and like you don't feel differently when you're
yeah,
on one side of that divide versus the
yeah.
other side of the divide. You're still just some guy.
Yeah, that happened to me because there was a magazine here locally in the North Alabama area where I was born, raised, and still live. That went for several years. I wrote for called the Valley Planet because we're in the Tennessee Valley, and I did what I called the sci-fi review column every 6 weeks in every other issue, and I reviewed one of the Doctor Who books. And when the trade paperback came out here in the U.S., because I had read it in hardcover, but bored in the bookstore one day, I picked it up and was flipping through it, and I'm reading the critics' reviews at the front of the book, and suddenly getting to one of them and go, why does this seem familiar? And got to the end of it and went, oh my God, it's me. And it took everything in my power not to start jumping up and down in the middle of a Barnes and Noble. It's like, and again, it's a bit like the stuff with Big Finish, or indeed talking about my fiction writing, the Sidewise Award up there. I never in my wildest dreams as a teenager, discovering that alternate history was a thing and that they gave out an award for it, ever imagined I would have one on a bookcase with my name on it. I don't think it really sunk in that it had happened. And this was before I even won. It was when I was still a nominee, when I reviewed, I think it was Mary Robinette Kowal's The Faded Sky. And Sea Lion decided to promote it by saying, Sidewise nominee Matthew Kresal reviews Sidewise Award winner Mary Robinette Kowal. And I'm like, this is going to take some getting used to.
Yeah.
And I still have no earthly idea how in the world I won that thing. And it was one of the many things I wrote in 2020. And funnily enough, it's the thing that led me to Sea Lion in a roundabout sort of way, because they introduced me to the company at large through Jared Kavanaugh. And because I'd had such a great experience doing Moonshot, that I reached out and decided, what, I'll pitch Our Man on the Hill here. Funnily enough, Our Man on the Hill's only ever went to one publisher who picked it up immediately. So I don't know whether that was just dumb luck or what.
Yeah, I mean, my anthology was directly approved by Tom Black himself, so same there. And yeah, it's fortunate we have a publishing house
Yeah.
for this genre, in the forum that gets them. I mean, it's good from a business perspective. So you have the authors there; they can feed the publishing house with their ideas, and then they get more
Yeah.
books. Okay, so seeing as we're almost running out of time, Matthew, do you have any last remarks to say?
Not particularly, I don't think. I mean, I've got more stuff in the pipeline, a couple of things which have been pitched that I haven't heard about. I've got a second novel, which is more in the kind of kiss kiss bang bang side of the spy genre. I describe it as a cli-fi spy-fi novel,
Okay.
which is what I'm editing at the moment, and I'm going to start pitching around hopefully in the near future. And I've got some nonfiction essays coming out in a couple of places as well. So there is plenty more to come from me, for better or worse, depending on one's point of view.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Thank you for taking the time to support Warp Factor in all the ways you have, and for being on this call. And thank you, Warp Factor, for tuning in and reading our stuff. Thank you very much, and good night.